Our next presentation is called Southern Illinois Civil War Stories, Three Women's Perspectives. It will feature Betsy Brown and Laura Varner of the General John A. Logan Museum in Murphysboro. Betsy taught history in the Carbondale School District for 27 years. She has served on the board of the Logan Museum for 8 years and is currently its president. Laura holds a degree in cultural anthropology with additional coursework in museum studies and public administration. She has been involved with the Logan Museum for 22 years and is now its curator and director. Please welcome Laura and Betsy.
Thank you for having us and letting us share our story. And that's what the focus is, isn't it? We've all got stories to tell, and all of our regions here in Southern Illinois have wonderful stories. And I don't think enough people hear those. And we're all kind of small. And I think it would be great if we could all work together. And I'm hearing this everywhere I go, all the people that I talk to. There's strength in numbers. And I would be glad to hear from any of you to begin say a museum trail, a history trail, to get our stories out there, to let people know what all has happened here in Southern Illinois. So Betsy and I are just going to cover a couple of those stories, and it is one of just thousands, so we begin.
Hello. You know, a lot has changed since I was a little girl. I was born in 1838, born Mary Cunningham, in a small town in Missouri. My maternal grandfather had of slaves, and when my parents got married, he gave them 4 slaves as a wedding gift. Now, what happened next was really a good idea for me, in my estimation, because my paternal grandfather became aged and needed help. So what he did is he asked my parents to move to Southern Illinois and help him out. And in doing so, my parents freed their 4 slaves. Thank goodness.
My name is Mary Jane Cummings. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my family and our experiences during the Civil War. I'll do this by talking about letters myself and my siblings wrote to one another. I was born in 1833 in Jackson County. After being married and widowed at the age of 22, I then married Joseph Cummings, a carpenter from New York. For a short time, we lived with my brother Bill, who lost his wife to illness and was left to raise his daughter on his own. We next moved to Mound City in 1862, where Joe found work. There was plenty of work to be had there in Mound City. There was a naval base that included a shipyard with marine ways, a foundry, marine barracks, supply offices, and a hospital. With all of that, there was a great need for a good builder, which of course Joe was. I feel blessed to have had my family to write to during the war. What frightening and worrisome times those were. Me and my brothers and sister lost both of our parents before the war began, so it was just us siblings to comfort and counsel each other. My parents, Alan Richards, born in Kentucky, and Rachel Maynard, born in North Carolina, married in Mercer County, Kentucky in 1820. I was the 3rd child of their 7. They had 2 sons while still living in Kentucky, Alexander, we called Sandy, and William. My parents then moved to Jackson County before 1825 and had James and Eliza Ann. That dear sister died before the war. She was only 35. I was next to be born, and then my sister, younger by 3 years, was Rachel Emeline. Well, everyone called her Emeline, as to not confuse her with Mama. She and I stayed very close during the war, even if it was only through letters. We wrote back and forth from my temporary home in Mound City and her back home in Jackson County. The next sibling born was Thomas, and finally, my youngest brother Benjamin, called him Benny. He was born in 1843. All of my brothers gladly joined up in the Union Army. Bill and Thomas joined Company K of the 18th, which became part of the Mississippi Marine Brigade. James joined Company D of the 81st. Benny followed all his older brother's footsteps by mustering into Company H of the 27th along with Sandy. But Benny, poor brave boy, died of illness less than 2 years later. In any case, if you haven't heard of the Mississippi Marine Brigade, it was an Army command that was operated under the direction of the Navy. But when it came down to it, those boys was mostly on their own. They did take care of many Confederates, whether it was soldiers or just some group of attacking rebels. They did a bunch of fighting both on water and on land.
We moved to Marion, Illinois, which was sparsely populated and had very few schools. Women had to do back-breaking work, milk the cows, cook 4 meals a day, spin, cart, and make the clothes for their family. It was a heck of a time. My father was sheriff of Williamson County, and he was by far the most popular man in the county. In fact, when he decided to fight in the Mexican War, many men in town decided to go with him. And so he formed Company B, 1st Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and marched his men to Alton, Illinois, and there he met Captain Hamilton of Jackson County. His first lieutenant was John A. Logan of Jackson County. Now, the two men hit it off right well, and my father always said that John was genial, a lot of fun, full of adventure. And sure enough, as they marched to Santa Fe, New Mexico, in order to join the troops there, they had a lot of time to share stories about on the trail as they crossed the great American desert, facing Indians and the travails of being on the trail. And so John made my father promise that he would give his daughter's hand in marriage as soon as she was of age, and that daughter was me. And so years went by, and I graduated from, at the age of 17, St. Vincent's Academy in Morganfield, Kentucky. Moved back to Shawneetown, where my dad was the circuit court, where he was working at the circuit court. John was the prosecuting attorney for the 3rd Judicial Court, and he would come to call. I thought he was coming to see my father, but no, he was coming to court me. Who would have thought that this man, so ambitious, so talented, and 29 years old, would hazard his career by marrying a 17-year-old? Well, after we married, we moved to Benton. And in Benton, life was wonderful. John won a seat in the Illinois legislature. I did not go with him because we had a 2-month-old baby boy, and I did not want to stay in a hotel. And so I stayed home. A little bit later, John won a seat in the Congress. This time, I did go with him because that little boy died at less than a year old. And as we went on, John had to make a decision. The country was in great turmoil. He had to decide what side would he be on when it came to the Union. And he had listened to the Democratic Party beliefs, and he was questioning them. And he heard Abraham Lincoln say, "A house divided cannot stand." And he thought about that. And he decided, after he heard about the firing on Fort Sumter, he would take a stand for the Union. And this was certainly cemented in July of 1861 when he went as a congressional observer at the first Battle of Bull Run. And there he was with his top hat and his tails on as an observer. He sees what's happening to the Union as the Confederates take control. He reaches down, picks up a rifle, and goes charging into battle. And at that time, he knows he has to become a Union soldier. And he does, and resigns his seat in Congress.
I am so very proud of my brothers for stepping up to defend the Union. But as I told my sister, I think it is too wretched as to how our men does manage this war business. I wish I had the power that God has. It would be brought to a close at the twinkle of an eye. I would say, peace, be still, But if it did not stop at that, I would command a clap of thunder and lightning to the secesh. They would put it into secession double quick. I also constantly searched for the news of river battles, especially since I knew my brothers could be in danger there. In February '63, I wrote Emeline, "Perhaps you have heard of the Queen of the West." By the way, she was a flagship of the U.S. Ram Fleet and the MMB. She ran the blockade of Vicksburg. There was 100 cannon fired at her and a score of rifles, but she passed through, much to the surprise of the rebels. The boat received 14 shots in her, 2 of them in the hull, but they still did not injure her much. She sank 3 Secesh boats loaded with provisions. That makes 3 blockades she has ran. I say, bully for the Queen. And then 2 months later, I wrote, "I have been almost crazy since I heard the Lancaster was sunk. I heard it before it came out in the paper. Emeline, I do hope our dear brothers is yet spared to us. I've seen the account of the drowned, scalded, wounded. They did not mention any person's name I know, so I'm persuaded to think that they had been put on another boat. Lord, I hope they've been put on another boat. I hope it is so, but I'm afraid to think of them being saved for fear they are not." The Lancaster was a side-wheel steamer used by the Union Army as a ram ship. It was sunk while helping out near a blockade in Vicksburg. Luckily, our brothers did escape harm that day.
In 1861, Cairo was seen as pivotal for the control of men and goods. North to south on the Mississippi, and then heading further south and east on the Ohio River, going through Kentucky, Tennessee, and out to the Carolinas. At the time, Cairo was a sea of white tents filled with Union soldiers. Families and friends came to see them as the soldiers themselves could not leave to go home. And so there they were, and they would camp as close as the commanding officers would allow. And as it happened, Logan's men suffered an attack of the measles. 500 of John A. Logan's regiment came down with the measles. There are 1,000 men in a regiment. That means 1/2 of the Illinois 31st was sick with the measles. And so they were lying on the ground, and John was just loath to see them lying there. And so he went and requisitioned a city hotel, called the City Hotel, as a hospital. And so I looked and I saw that not only did they requisition the hospital, but they failed to requisition furniture. So these men were sitting or lying on the floor in the hospital. And so I urged John that I could go get the necessary cots, blankets, pillows, etc. And I could travel 60 miles north to Carbondale and to Marion, and I would get those supplies and bring them back within 36 hours. So he thought it was okay. And so I got the 2 a.m. train out of Cairo and went to Carbondale and to Marion and talked to my friends and say, give me your finest supplies, your blankets, your homemade blankets, your pillows, your homespun linens, your jams, jellies, marmalades, and other delicacies. And I came back with carloads. Now you have to remember though, these blankets were made for people, by the women for their own beds. These were not military grade. And so when they hung them out to dry, to air out the windows of the hospital, it was really quite colorful. And in fact, the hospital had a name. It was called the Striped Hospital of the Illinois 31st, given those colorful blankets. And at the time, that was all there was, because in the future, they would use pavilions and hospital tents. But at that time, that's all there was. So I returned home to wait news of the first battle.
In March of 1864, I wrote to Emeline once more. Dear sister, it is dreadful sick down here, and a great many deaths. There was 2 corpses taken out of one house here last Thursday. One was a young woman, and the other her sister, about 10 years old. They died of measles. Aunt Cole died last Monday night with consumption of the brain. I went out in the country with them to bury her. We was gone from 9 in the morning to nearly 5 in the evening. It was the worst road I'd ever traveled in my life. Mud and waters up to the axle nearly half the time. The graveyard was to the right of Villa Ridge. The man that hauled the corpses charged Cole $7. I think there is 3 to 4 corpses a day of the citizens that has to be hauled out.
Time came for the first Battle of Belmont. Now, this was the first battle the Illinois 31st would be involved with. And so the friends and family who had been camping with the troops waved them goodbye and waited anxiously. And they waited 36 hours. And the troops came back to wild cheers. And it was certain that the men had been victorious. And at this time, they were awaiting a new commander. And this gentleman came. He came in civilian clothes. He wore civilian clothes. He was riding an unremarkable horse and was only accompanied by one other soldier. When he asked to meet and address those troops, they were thrilled with the man. And the man? General Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant's first venture was to seize Fort Henry. Fort Henry was a very easy mark. And they became, after Fort Henry, they decided they were going to move on to Fort Donelson because gunboats had already started bombing Fort Donelson, and he wanted to finish it off. And so the weather changed. It became ungodly cold. It was so cold that men had to keep moving or else they would freeze to death. John was continuously in his saddle, only taking brief rests, and in doing so, he would lie down, put his saddle under his head, use his saddle blanket, and when he would wake up, the saddle blanket would be frozen. And because of this exposure, he contracted rheumatism, which plagued him for the rest of his life and indeed would cause him to die. Now, the Telegraph was a newspaper, and I opened it up to see about the battle. And sure enough, Fort Donelson had fallen. It was February of 1862. They listed the men who had been killed or wounded. And my husband's name, Colonel John A. Logan, was among those who had been killed.
There sure was a lot of commotion as troops gathered down at Cairo, getting ready for a fight at Fort Donelson. I got a letter from Sandy, February 10th of '62, that said, "Before this reaches you, our forces will have a bloody battle. The soldiers comes in by the thousands. There have been 6 regiments in here since yesterday morning. They left for the scene of action with hearts full of joy." Hearts full of joy, can you imagine? I said to Emeline, "I'll tell you what, our young men worry me so. They see this war as one big adventure. Sandy told me how the commander of Fort Henry told our officer he was proud to surrender to a gentleman. Our commanders thanked him and told him that he would have not surrendered at all if we had blowed all of his boats out of the river. I was afraid that despite what the adventures were they thought they were having, they would soon learn something different. Some already had. I asked Emeline to let me know when she heard from Dolly, who had been happily wedded a short while ago. Poor thing, widowed at such a young age. I feel sorry for her, but we may all be left to shift for ourselves before this dreadful war is over."
Upon reading about the news of my husband, I, of course, went to Cairo. Many people were flocking to Cairo because they too wanted to find their lost family members or the family members who had been injured. Now, the War Department had decreed that no one was to use the transports because Grant was expecting reinforcements and needed to travel down to Pittsburgh's Landing and on to Corinth. So I went to the headquarters at Cairo and talked to a Colonel Graham. And I asked him for a pass. And he said, "Madam, the military necessity requires that no one have a pass. This man was so annoying. He was imperious, obviously without compassion. I was furious, heartbroken, and I said to him, "Sir, should the demands of war cause you to enter into the front, and should you be so unfortunate as to suffer the fatalities of war, then I believe the military necessity would not allow Mrs. Graham to come to you." And he looked at me and he said, "Madam, there is no Mrs. Graham." Well, then I said to him, "Well, if one had been intended for you, I hope she died in infancy." And so I left. And as I left, I heard that both Governors Yates of Illinois and Governor Morse of Indiana had chartered steamers who would go down the river to collect the wounded and the fallen and return them to their respective states. And Colonel Dunlap of Jacksonville said to me, and he came out and he whispered to me, "You know, there is a steamer leaving very shortly. Go down to the wharf. Tell them that you are a member of my family. Go on board and tell them that I will be joining you shortly. Go hide, and then I will make orders such that you will be protected." And so naturally, I scurried on down to the wharf, and as I went to aboard, there was the captain of the ship. And it happened that it was Captain Alter. Now, the reason why this is just wonderful news is because Captain Alter had been defended by John when he was an attorney, and Captain Alter had a little bit of a problem with manslaughter. He was accused of killing a roustabout who had been employed on his ship, and John got him off. And so Captain Alter was really quite happy with John, and therefore said, and looked at me, and knowing full well I had no pass, he says to me, "Come on then, you should go to Logan." And so he led me up a winding stairs to the hurricane deck, showed me a stateroom, and I stayed there, and I did not come out until there was a knock on my door, and he said, "Do come out, supper's ready." And so we traveled on the river until we almost ran into the Uncle Sam, which happened to be the steamer where General Grant had his headquarters. Now, the weather had been just awful, and General Grant had not been able to move the wounded and the fatalities up north because of the ice on the river. And so he had had John moved to his headquarters. And there I found him, his left arm strapped to his body, a mini ball having run through the shoulder joint. Then a mini ball had also hit his pistol that he held on his belt, nearly breaking his ribs. He said he suffered greatly from that, almost as much as from the mini ball in his shoulder. Now, he was very much in pain. But you know, first of all, I am the eldest of 13. My mama taught me how to take care of the ill and the injured, what they should have to eat as a diet. And I had also come prepared. I came with blankets, and clothing, and food. And sure enough, I nursed him. Sometimes there were complications, and a surgeon's skills were required. But after he was sleeping peacefully, I went with some of my friends to see about the others who had been injured, because as I said, they hadn't been moved, and what Grant had done, he had commandeered several vacant homes and turned them into hospitals. And we worked with those people and trying to get them the help that they needed. Once John was able to be moved, I took him home to Jackson County. And his wounds weren't even healed when he heard about the Battle of Shiloh. And sure enough, that man took off for the Battle of Shiloh. And he was in the war for the remainder of the time.
You know, I worried something terrible about my brothers and neighbors off fighting in that war. But the really awful thing is, you had to worry about them when they was at home, too. During the war, there was known to be some attacks on Union soldiers by secessionist sympathizers. They was known as Copperheads and Knights of the Golden Circle here in Illinois, Southern Illinois. In January '64, I wrote to my sister, "I've been uneasy about Thomas ever since I heard he was at home, but still hope he will not get harmed. It makes me shudder to think he's been in the service nearly 3 years and not been hurt, and now he's at home and his life is in danger. Tell him never to get to the door if anybody should holler after dark. They might come with false orders from the captain, but if the captain wants him, he will write to him. Don't fail to tell him to be on his watch night and day and persuade him to stay sober and keep his wits about him. I would hate to beg him to go back to the boat, but I think it would be safer for him instead of being out here on his own. Write me every week while Thomas is at home so I can hear the things that's going on." The war seemed as if it would never end. I can't believe Benny is dead, and we will never get to hear him laugh again as he did when he played his happy tunes. How horrible it was. How horrible this war was, and how many, many people we have lost. I couldn't wait for it to be over and have my family back together before it had a chance to take any more of us. I can't imagine the awful sights that my brothers saw. Very little is known about Mary Jane. We do know that she had a daughter, also named Mary Jane, who died in 1873 at the age of 12. And Mary died just a couple years later at the age of 42. We also know quite a bit of confusion with her last name, Cummings, as it was often also written as Cummings. Not really surprising, considering here in Southern Illinois to drop the letter G at the end of words. Emeline also lived to be 65. Sandy, all the brothers made it home. Some of them died at a younger age than we would expected, and I assume from the hardships of war. The one that sticks out, though, is little Benny. Benny was a musician in Company H of the 27th. He was 18 years old whenever he signed up, and boy, was he gung-ho about the war. He just couldn't wait to fight and be a brave soldier. But he was also a musician for his company because he loved music. Military records list his death as disease at Cairo. His brother Sandy wrote to their family 3 days before his death. He said he had been sick for 3 weeks and not even turned over in 5 days. When he asked Sandy who he wanted to see most, when he asked Benny who he wanted to see most, Benny just said, "Everyone. I just want to see everyone and I want to go home." And he did. His body was sent back home and he's buried at the Holiday Cemetery in Murphysboro.
John went on to serve 3 terms in the U.S. House, 3 terms in the U.S. Senate, and then he was also ran for vice president in the 1864 election with James Blaine. They lost, obviously, because you don't know President Blaine. And then he was also 3 terms as Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a veterans group of Union soldiers and became very politically powerful. And so and that is our story here. Mary went on to live until 1923, being a writer and very big with the American Red Cross, where Clara Barton was one of her best friends. And so if you want to know more, come to the museum. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So does the museum have these letters, is that right?
We have copies of those letters. We have some original letters, but this family of 5 brothers and 2 sisters, there's a tremendous amount of letters, but we received them as Xerox copies. And that's why we played on this story. So there are things added. So you've heard based on a true story. That would be this story today. But yes, we do have copies of those letters and several others. Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned about collaborating with different museums.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
We want to create a museum trail similar to the wine trail, which has been extremely popular and successful. And so we believe that all these small museums throughout Southern Illinois could get together and create, a brochure giving people a driving. This will take you how many hours to do this one, and because there are quite a few small museums, and there's strength in numbers. If we found, got together and pooled our resources, we could create a really fascinating and also so good for tourism.
Yeah, there could be a single website for all of us. One brochure that shows all of our locations and how to get to them. I just really think that could be a great idea, and I see a lot of interest in it.